There's a brooch sitting in a box somewhere in America right now. It's shaped like a turtle. The shell is a chunk of clear plastic, the kind that looks almost like a gummy candy. It was made in the 1940s. It cost a few dollars when it was new, and for decades, it sat in a jewelry box getting passed over for something shinier. A few years ago, a sterling silver version of that exact turtle sold at auction for over $1,000. That's not a typo, and it's not the exception you're imagining. It's one data point in a pattern that's playing out right now in basements and attics and storage units across the country, because the generation that bought this jewelry bought it by the millions, at department stores and home parties and out of the Avon catalog, is now in its 70s, 80s, and 90s. Their kids are cleaning out the houses, and most of them have no idea what they're looking at. This video is a list. 10 brands that flooded the jewelry boxes of baby boomer America between the 1950s and the 1980s. Some of them are worth exactly what you'd think. Nothing. Some of them are worth more than people's actual paychecks. By the end, you'll know which is which, and you'll know how to tell them apart, because the difference usually isn't the brand name. It's one specific detail most people walk right past. Here's why this matters right now, more than it would have 10 years ago. The baby boomer generation, roughly 1946 to 1964, is the largest generational wealth transfer in American history, and a huge percentage of that transfer isn't houses or stocks. It's stuff, drawers of stuff, and costume jewelry sits in a strange blind spot. It's not fine jewelry, so people assume it has no resale value, but it's also not junk, because some of it was made with more skill and more care than anything you'd find in a store today. The result is that estate sales and donation bins are flooded with pieces that are routinely either thrown out, sold in bulk lots for a few dollars, or, and this happens constantly, broken apart for the metal. So we're counting down. 10 brands, starting with the ones that are mostly sentimental, ending with the ones that can genuinely run into the thousands. Number 10 is Sarah Coventry. If you grew up around a grandmother who hosted jewelry parties in her living room, friends over, coffee poured, a saleswoman laying out trays of necklaces on the dining table, there's a good chance that saleswoman was selling Sarah Coventry. Founded in 1949, the company built its entire business model around home parties instead of store shelves, and it worked. For decades, Sarah Coventry pieces were sold almost exclusively this way, which means an enormous number of American households ended up with at least one piece, usually a matched set, earrings, necklace, sometimes a bracelet, all designed to be bought and worn together. The honest reality check here, and we'll come back to this idea throughout the video. Most Sarah Coventry pieces sell today for single digits to maybe $20 or $30. The company made jewelry to be affordable and plentiful is the enemy of value. But the brand earns its spot on this list because of what happens when a piece was discontinued quickly or made in a smaller run. Those specific sets can catch collectors off guard, selling for noticeably more than the bulk of what's out there, simply because nobody expected to need more than the handful that exist. Number 9 is Napier. If Sarah Coventry was the living room party brand, Napier was the department store brand. The one sitting at the jewelry counter next to the perfume, marked at a price point comfortable for a middle-class budget. The company actually goes back to 1878 under a different name, became Napier in 1922, and by 1944 had grown into the largest privately owned manufacturer of fashion jewelry in the entire country. That scale is exactly why so much of it survives today, and exactly why most individual pieces aren't worth much. Napier didn't make rare things, it made reliable things, by the hundreds of thousands. Where Napier gets interesting is in its earlier work, particularly pieces from the 1950s and 60s that are clearly signed and still have their original clasp hardware intact. A signed, complete Napier set from that era, especially anything with a more unusual design rather than a basic chain, can sell for meaningfully more than the common pieces. Not life-changing money, but enough that it's worth checking before you assume it's worthless. Number 8 is Avon. This is the one almost everybody has a story about, because almost everyone's grandmother or mother bought from an Avon representative at some point. The company started in 1886 as a perfume business and didn't introduce jewelry as its own product line until 1970. Before that, jewelry pieces were sometimes given away as gifts with a purchase, which is actually part of why some of the earliest Avon jewelry is hard to even identify today, since it wasn't marked with the Avon name. Most Avon jewelry, even now, sells for genuinely small amounts. $10, $20, maybe $60 for a nicer necklace. The company made jewelry the same way it made lipstick, in volume, for a mass market, at a price almost anyone could afford. But starting in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, Avon did something that changes the math entirely. It partnered with actual designers. Pieces designed by Kenneth J. Lane, by Jose and Maria Barrera, and most famously by Elizabeth Taylor, working under the Avon name, were produced in limited runs with noticeably higher build quality. An Elizabeth Taylor for Avon set, a particular three-piece royal jewels necklace, pendant, and earring combination comes up often, can sell in the range of $350 to $400. That's not a brooch found at a garage sale by accident. That's a specific, identifiable, designer collaboration piece, and it looks nothing like the rest of the Avon catalog once you know to look for it. Number 7 is Monet. If you picture the kind of clean, simple gold or silver-toned jewelry your mother or grandmother wore to the office in the 1970s, no stones, no color, just polished metal with a confident shape, that's very likely Monet. The company actually started in 1929, making decorative metal adornments for purses, shifted into jewelry by 1937, and hit its real stride in the 1970s and 80s with what the industry called tailored jewelry. Pieces designed for women who were increasingly working professional jobs and wanted something that read as polished rather than decorative. Monet basically invented the look of corporate office jewelry, and it sold an enormous volume of it. That same enormous volume is why most Monet pieces today sell modestly. Monet jewelry is still easy to find at any department store, since Liz Claiborne has owned the trademark since 2000 and modern versions are still in production. But there's a specific marker that changes the value. The Monet name wasn't even stamped onto pieces before 1955. So if you find an unmarked piece with construction and styling consistent with Monet's known designs from that early era, you may be holding something the company itself never labeled, which, to a collector, makes it rarer than almost anything currently sitting on a store shelf with the name stamped right on it. Number 6 is Whiting & Davis. This one has a genuinely unusual origin story. The company was founded all the way back in 1876 in Massachusetts, and it didn't start in jewelry at all. It started by manufacturing woven metal mesh evening bags. That mesh technique became the company's signature, and by the time the 1970s and 80s rolled around, that exact metal mesh construction, fluid, almost fabric-like chains of tiny linked metal, became hugely popular again, riding the wave of disco-era fashion that wanted movement and shine. Whiting & Davis mesh pieces from that 70s-80s run have held their collector demand more consistently than a lot of brands on this list, partly because the manufacturing technique itself is distinctive and hard to mistake for anything else. You're not just identifying a name stamped on the back, you're identifying a construction method you can feel in your hands. That tactile signature is part of why this brand has stayed steady rather than fading the way some of its mass-market peers have. We're halfway through this list, and it's worth pausing for the rehook because there's a pattern forming that's bigger than any single brand. Notice that in every case so far, the name on the back of the piece was never the real answer. Sarah Coventry, Napier, Avon, Monet, Whiting & Davis. In every single one, the actual value came down to a narrower detail. A specific collaboration line, a specific manufacturing era, a construction technique, or the literal absence of a mark on a piece old enough to predate the company's own labeling. If you walked away from this video only remembering brand names, you'd be checking the wrong thing. The real skill is checking the era and the construction, with the brand name as just the starting clue. That distinction matters even more for the next 5 brands, because the numbers start climbing, and so does the gap between the common version and the rare version. Number 5 is Eisenberg. This brand has one of the more unusual business origins on this list. Jonas Eisenberg started a clothing company, and for a while, jewelry wasn't even the product. It was the accessory that came free with the clothes. Customers liked the jewelry so much that Eisenberg's sons eventually started selling it as its own separate line, and the jewelry business ultimately outlasted the clothing it was originally designed to accompany. Eisenberg jewelry tends to be enamel work or rhinestone pieces, and Christmas-themed brooches in particular, rhinestone trees especially, are a recurring favorite among collectors today. Individually, pieces generally sell in a fairly modest range, roughly $15 to $100, but complete matched sets are where this brand jumps categories entirely. A full set, brooch, bracelet, and earrings together, was appraised on Antiques Roadshow at around $1,300. That's not a single rare brooch a collector hunted down for years. That's a set that could plausibly still be sitting together, untouched, in someone's jewelry box right now because nobody separated it. Number 4 is Coro. If Monet invented the look of office jewelry, Coro was doing something almost the opposite. Playful, whimsical, designed to be charming rather than serious. The company's roots go back to 1901, and the name Coro itself comes from combining the first 2 letters of its founders' last names. For decades, Coro operated almost like a training ground for the entire costume jewelry industry. Many designers who later started their own famous brands actually got their start working for Coro first, which is part of why so much of the era's broader design language traces back to this one company. Most individual Coro pieces today land in a familiar, modest range. But there's one specific design line that breaks the pattern dramatically: the Coro Duet. These were dual-purpose brooches, designed so the piece could either be worn as one larger brooch or split apart into 2 smaller clips. A signed, well-preserved duet, particularly one tied to a known design like the Carmen Miranda pattern from the late 1930s, has sold for over $1,800 at auction, even with some visible wear on the stones. The mechanism itself, the fact that it does something clever and functional, is part of why collectors will pay a real premium over an otherwise similar fixed brooch. Number 3 is Weiss. This is a brand that, frankly, peaked and faded faster than almost anything else on this list, which is exactly why it's worth paying attention to. Albert Weiss founded the company in 1942 after learning the trade at Coro, and Weiss built its reputation specifically on rhinestone quality, clarity, sparkle, and precision cutting that was genuinely a step above a lot of its competitors. The company hit its peak in the 1950s and into the 60s. Weiss himself retired in 1960, and the company shut down entirely by 1971. Less than 30 years of total operation. That short production window is exactly the mechanism that drives the value up. There's simply a smaller total universe of Weiss pieces than there is of a brand like Napier or Monet that operated for decades longer. A well-preserved Weiss piece with intact, high-clarity rhinestones regularly sells in the $100 to $300 range. Not the absolute ceiling on this list, but a meaningfully higher floor than several brands we've already covered, achieved through scarcity alone rather than any one famous design line. Number 2 is Miriam Haskell. This brand sits in a slightly different category than everything else on this list, and it's worth naming that difference directly. Where most of these companies were built around fast, affordable, mass-manufactured pieces, Haskell built its reputation on the opposite. Handmade construction, intricate filigree metalwork, and faux pearls and beads assembled with a level of detail that was closer to fine jewelry techniques than typical costume jewelry. The result was a brand that, even in its own era, was worn by genuine Hollywood stars and socialites rather than purely the general consumer market. It occupied a slightly more aspirational tier from the very beginning. That handmade construction is exactly why Haskell pieces have held value more consistently than almost any other name on this list. Well-preserved, signed Haskell pieces routinely sell in the hundreds of dollars, and rarer, more elaborate designs push into the low thousands. Unlike several of the brands we've covered, you don't need to find one specific rare collaboration line to hit real money with Haskell. The baseline itself is simply higher, because the work itself was never mass-produced the same way. And that brings us to number 1, Trifari. Trifari is, by a meaningful margin, the brand that can produce the most dramatic gap on this entire list between what a piece looks like and what it's actually worth. Gustavo Trifari founded the company in 1910, But the turning point came in 1930, when designer Alfred Philippe joined. A man who had previously designed for Cartier and for Van Cleef & Arpels, two of the most prestigious fine jewelry houses in the world. Philippe brought that same eye for craftsmanship into costume jewelry, and the difference shows. Trifari pieces were deliberately built to evoke real fine jewelry, using rhinestones, careful metalwork, and design techniques borrowed directly from the world Philippe came from. Most individual Trifari pieces today sell in a range that's healthy but not shocking, roughly $80 to $1,500, which on its own would already put Trifari ahead of most of this list. But there's one specific design category that changes everything: the Jelly Belly line. These are figural brooches. Animals, mostly, made between approximately 1938 and the late 1940s. Built around a centerpiece of clear or colored lucite shaped to look like a glossy, jelly-like belly on a bird, a fish, a turtle, an insect. They're whimsical, they're small, and at a glance, to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at, they look exactly like inexpensive costume jewelry. That's the entire point of how dramatic this gets. Common jelly belly animals, the more frequently produced designs, sell in the hundreds of dollars. But rarer designs, particularly insect jelly bellies like spiders and certain sea life pieces, along with the rarest Alfred Philippe designed examples, have sold for $3,000 to over $5,000. A single brooch, one that someone's grandmother may have worn to church on a Sunday in 1948, thinking nothing more of it than that it was a pretty little pin shaped like a turtle. So here's the honest takeaway, and it's the same one we set up at the very start of this video. Most vintage costume jewelry, even from these exact 10 brands, is not going to be worth thousands of dollars. The realistic range for the vast majority of what's sitting in attics and donation boxes right now is somewhere between a few dollars and a few hundred. That's not a disappointing ending. That's the accurate one. And accuracy is the entire reason this list is worth anything at all. What it does mean is this: before any of this jewelry gets thrown away, sold in a $5 bulk lot, or broken apart for scrap metal, it's worth 30 seconds to actually look. Check for a signature on the back. Check the era of the clasp and the earring backs. Older pieces use mechanisms that simply aren't used anymore. And if you find a name like Trifari or Haskell or a designer collaboration stamp from Avon, don't assume. Look it up first. Because somewhere out there, in a box that almost got donated, there's a turtle-shaped brooch waiting to surprise somebody.